Episode 7 The Michigan Dog Man.
Welcome back to the dark side of reality.
There are places in the world where silence doesn't feel like absence. It feels like a presence, like something unseen has settled into the space around you, paying attention without revealing itself. In northern forests, especially across Michigan's vast stretches of wilderness, there are long-standing reports of something that does not belong comfortably in any known category of wildlife. Do you believe in wolves that are said to reach 7 to 13 feet in height when standing upright? An amalgamation of canine, wolf, and man? Moving through dense forests as if the normal rules of anatomy and biology no longer apply to them. Not quite wolf, not quite bear, not quite anything that should be able to move the way it does. Some witnesses describe it in a way that immediately creates tension in the mind. A creature standing far larger than any normal canine, sometimes estimated between 7 feet, and in rarer claims, closer to 13 feet when fully upright. A figure that moves through the tree line on 2 legs, yet carries itself with the instincts of something far more predatory than human. What they also report, often in fragmented, shaken descriptions, are details that don't fit neatly into any known animal profile. Bright red to deep amber glowing eyes that seem to lock onto witnesses with unsettling precision. Long, sharp, elongated black fingers and hands, almost raccoon-like in their flexibility and shape, ending in hooked claws that appear capable of both climbing and grasping with unnatural dexterity. But what unsettles people most is not just its size, it is the contradiction of it. Because the human brain tries instinctively to categorize what it sees: bear, man, animal, trick of light, something familiar, something explainable. And yet, according to decades of accounts, none of those explanations ever fully fit. Instead, witnesses describe a shape that interrupts understanding, something that appears for only seconds at a time, standing at the edge of visibility, partially obscured by trees, road glare, or darkness itself, long enough to register, not long enough to confirm, and then it disappears. This is where the Michigan Dogman legend begins to take shape, not in certainty, but in repeated uncertainty. Across rural roads, logging paths, isolated cabins, and deep forest trails, people who have no connection to one another have described similar encounters. The details shift slightly depending on the witness, but the core description remains remarkably stable. An upright, canine-like form, a powerful frame, a sense of intelligence behind its stillness, and most consistently, eyes that seem to reflect more than just light. Eyes that glow, eyes that feel directed, intentional, and aware. Some describe amber reflections caught in headlights, Others recall a faint glow in total darkness, but nearly all accounts agree on one unsettling point. It was looking back. Not reacting, not fleeing, observing. And in that moment of recognition, something changes in the witness's experience. Fear is not gradual, it is immediate, psychological, a deep instinctual response that does not require explanation to take hold. Skeptics often attribute these accounts to misidentified wildlife, particularly bears standing upright in low visibility conditions, or optical illusions created by terrain and lighting. Others suggest memory distortion under stress, where the brain reconstructs ambiguous stimuli into something more structured and more threatening. These explanations are valid within scientific frameworks, but they do not fully erase the consistency in how these encounters are described across time and geography. Because the stories do not emerge from one region or one era alone. They appear in isolated pockets, across generations, often without cultural overlap between witnesses. That is what gives the legend its persistence, not proof of the creature itself, but the repetition of its outline. Tonight, we are not attempting to confirm the existence of anything. We are not forcing conclusions onto incomplete evidence. We are instead tracing the shape of a story that continues to appear whenever people find themselves too far from certainty and too close to the edge of the unknown. A story about something in the woods, something upright, something watching, and something that, for reasons still not understood, refuses to fully disappear from human experience. So follow me once again into the dark as we open another creepy case file as we investigate the Michigan Dogman.
The consistent description across decades.
If you strip away all speculation, all modern interpretation, and all internet mythology, what remains of the Michigan Dogman is surprisingly consistent in eyewitness testimony. Across more than a century of reported encounters, certain details repeat with unusual precision. Not identical stories, but identical patterns of perception. Witnesses describe something upright, always upright, not crouched like a wolf preparing to spring, not lumbering like a bear shifting weight between four limbs, but standing in a way that forces the human brain into conflict. Because upright posture belongs to humans, and yet what they are seeing is not human. The estimated height varies slightly between accounts, but most place the figure between 7 and 9 feet tall. Tall enough that the tree branches at lower levels partially obscure its frame. Broad enough that its shoulders extend beyond what seems anatomically natural for a canine structure. The fur is almost always described as dark brown, black, or charcoal gray. Not fluffy like a wolf in winter coat, but coarse, dense, almost matted in some descriptions, as though it has spent long periods moving through dense brush. But it is not just the body that unsettles witnesses, it is everything extending beyond it. Reports frequently include unsettling anatomical inconsistencies that do not match known wildlife behavior. Some witnesses describe long, black, elongated fingers and hands, almost raccoon-like in their flexibility and segmentation, ending in sharp, curved claws capable of both gripping and climbing in ways that appear unnatural for a canine structure. These hands are often described as hanging loosely when the creature stands still, only to tense and articulate with precision when it moves. But it is the head that creates the most cognitive dissonance. Witnesses describe a canine-like skull structure, elongated muzzle, pronounced jawline, pointed ears that remain upright even when the body is still. And then the eyes. The eyes are where descriptions stop being merely biological and start becoming emotional. Some describe reflection from light sources like headlights or flashlights, but many witnesses emphasize something more unsettling. The sensation that the eyes were not simply reflecting light, but absorbing attention, locking focus, holding it. Amber, yellow, sometimes described as faintly glowing blue, but always described as intentional, aware, and directed. One of the most recurring themes in these accounts is not aggression, but observation. The creature is often described as still, completely still, standing between trees or at the edge of visibility as though it is evaluating rather than reacting. When movement does occur, witnesses describe it as wrong in a way they struggle to articulate. Too smooth for something so large, too fast for something so heavy, and too coordinated for something that should be animalistic. And then there is sound. The vocalizations associated with the dogman are not consistent, but they are always described as disturbing. Some hear traditional wolf-like howls. Others describe layered vocal tones that seem to overlap in unnatural ways. And some even report sounds that resemble distorted human vocal patterns embedded within animalistic noise. What makes this particularly compelling in folklore analysis is not the supernatural framing, but the consistency across unrelated individuals, hunters, truck drivers, campers, people with no shared background or motivation, all describing something they cannot comfortably categorize, which is where legend begins to form.
The 1887 account and the lumber era encounters.
To understand where the Michigan Dogman legend begins to solidify, we must look at one of its earliest commonly cited origins, the 1887 lumber camp account in Wexford County. During this period, Michigan's northern forests were still heavily undeveloped and dominated by logging operations. Entire camps of workers lived in isolation for months at a time, surrounded by dense wilderness with minimal outside contact. In this environment, survival depended on familiarity with wildlife behavior. Experienced lumber workers knew the difference between wolves, bears, and unfamiliar movement patterns in the woods. According to compiled oral histories and later folkloric documentation, 2 lumberjacks reported encountering something unusual deep in the forest. At first, they believed it was a man, a figure walking upright between trees. But something about its proportions immediately felt wrong. The height was excessive. The shoulders were too broad. The movement too fluid. As they observed it, the figure allegedly shifted posture in a way that defied natural human biomechanics, standing fully upright. It appeared to exceed normal anatomical structure. The men reportedly froze, not out of curiosity, but instinctive threat recognition, the type of fear that bypasses rational thought entirely. Then came the vocalization, a loud, forceful sound described as a combination of howl and scream, not clearly animal, not clearly human, but something hybrid in perception. And then silence, followed by a rapid disappearance into dense forest cover. What makes this account significant in folklore study is not whether it can be independently verified in a scientific sense. It is that it becomes the foundational template for later reports. Following this period, similar accounts began appearing across northern Michigan in isolated regions. Hunters report upright canine-like figures at forest edges. Railroad workers describe strange encounters along undeveloped corridors. Farmers report unexplained livestock disturbances accompanied by nighttime sightings. Skeptical analysis often attributes these accounts to misidentification of bears standing upright. However, wildlife experts note that bears typically present distinctly different gait, head structure, and shoulder alignment when bipedal. Despite skepticism, the consistency of upright canine-like descriptions continues to appear across unrelated time periods, which raises an important folkloric question. When does repeated description across independent sources transition from coincidence into cultural pattern?
Indigenous traditions and the wolf as a symbol. Before the modern naming of the Dogman, the forests of the Great Lakes region were already rich with oral traditions from indigenous nations who lived in close relationship with the land. These traditions are diverse and should never be reduced to a single interpretation. But within many of them, the wolf holds significant symbolic importance. The wolf is often portrayed as a teacher, a guide, or a warning presence, depending on context. In some stories, it represents loyalty and survival within harsh environments. In others, it represents danger, imbalance, or consequences of human action. Within broader indigenous oral traditions, there are also narratives involving shape-shifting beings or spiritual entities tied to wilderness spaces. These stories are not typically framed as literal cryptids in the modern sense, but as teachings embedded within cultural understanding of nature and behavior. Modern folklorists have sometimes drawn comparisons between dogman sightings and broader archetypes found in global mythology. These include the Wendigo tradition and Algonquin storytelling, European werewolf legends, and various shapeshifter myths from different cultures worldwide. However, it is important to emphasize that these comparisons are analytical interpretations rather than direct equivalencies. What connects these stories across cultures is not necessarily shared origin, but shared psychological experience. The forest represents uncertainty, the unknown represents vulnerability, and the wolf becomes a symbolic form through which human fear is expressed. The Dogman legend may exist at the intersection of these symbolic frameworks, not necessarily as continuation, but as convergence, a modern manifestation of an ancient archetypal fear, the fear of being observed in nature, the fear of losing control in an environment that does not belong to humans, and the fear that something intelligent may exist beyond human classification.
Werewolf mythology and modern cryptozoological theory.
The concept of the werewolf is one of the oldest and most widespread transformation myths in human history. Across civilizations, the idea of humans shifting into wolf-like forms appears repeatedly in folklore, literature, and oral storytelling traditions. In ancient Greek accounts, transformation into wolves was sometimes tied to punishment or divine interaction. And medieval European folklore, lycanthropy, became associated with curses, disease, or supernatural influence. The word itself, werewolf, literally translates to man-wolf, a hybrid identity that exists between two categories of being. However, the Michigan Dogman differs significantly from classical transformation mythology. In most modern reports, there is no observed transformation event. Witnesses do not describe a human becoming something else. They describe encountering an already existing form. This creates a classification challenge for both folklorists and cryptozoologists. If it is not transformation-based mythology and not a known biological species, then what conceptual category does it belong to? This question has led to multiple interpretive frameworks. Biological hypotheses suggest misidentified wildlife or undiscovered species. Psychological models suggest perceptual distortion under environmental stress. Paranormal interpretations propose spiritual or interdimensional phenomena. Fringe hypotheses suggest experimental or anomalous biological origins. Despite these theories, no verifiable scientific evidence currently supports any of them. What remains consistent is the human response. Witnesses describe fear that is immediate and instinctive, a sense of presence and a strong impression of intelligence behind those glowing eyes. This emotional consistency is one of the most studied aspects of cryptid reporting, because regardless of origin, the experience itself is undeniably real and horrifying to those who report it.
modern sightings and roadway encounters.
In contemporary Michigan, dogman reports frequently cluster around transitional zones between wilderness and human infrastructure. Rural highways, forest roads, logging routes, areas where artificial light fades into natural darkness. One of the most common modern encounter types involves motorists traveling at night. Drivers report sudden visual anomalies at the edge of headlights, a figure standing near tree lines, movement that disappears when approached, and brief moments of eye reflection before vanishing entirely. Other reports come from hunters and campers. These individuals often describe extended periods of unexplained auditory phenomena, branch breaking sounds circling campsites, unusual animal silence preceding encounters, and vocalizations that do not match known wildlife patterns. Skeptical explanations typically attribute these experiences to misidentification in low-light conditions. The human brain is highly susceptible to pattern recognition errors when visibility is limited. However, researchers studying folklore transmission note that emotional consistency across reports remains notable. Fear responses described by witnesses are not subtle. They are immediate, psychological, and often described as instinctive rather than rational. This raises an important question within paranormal anthropology. Why do unrelated individuals report similar emotional responses in similar environments? Even if the external stimulus differs, the internal reaction appears consistent, which suggests that part of the phenomenon may lie in perception itself.
The evolution of the modern dogman legend.
Much of the modern fascination surrounding the Michigan Dogman can be traced back to a now famous Michigan radio broadcast known as The Legend. Created in 1987 by Traverse City radio DJ Steve Cook as an April Fool's Day joke on WTCM FM. The folk-style song described a terrifying creature roaming in the northern woods of Michigan. One lyric in particular captured listeners immediately. Somewhere in the north woods, darkness, a creature walks upright.
I went out there to take a look at it. And I just tried to chew in around the doors. And you could see a dog print, alongside the window there. So it was, obviously a dog.
What began as a playful local broadcast quickly spiraled into something far stranger. The situation was flooded with calls from listeners claiming they had either seen the creature themselves or knew someone who had. Many insisted these encounters had happened years before the song even ever aired. As the legend spread across Michigan, an additional belief slowly attached itself to the story. The idea that the creature reappears in cyclical intervals, most commonly every 10 years or during years ending in 7. Whether this was folklore evolution, coincidence, or genuine belief among witnesses, the concept became deeply tied to the mythology surrounding the Dogman. The modern Dogman legend gained widespread attention following a late 20th century Michigan radio broadcast that introduced a fictionalized version of the creature. Following this broadcast, listeners began contacting stations, reporting personal experiences. Some claimed encounters prior to the broadcast. Others began connecting older regional folklore to the modern description. This is a key moment in folklore evolution because it demonstrates how modern media can influence the structure of traditional storytelling. Once introduced into public consciousness, the Dogman narrative began to evolve rapidly. Local retellings expanded descriptions, internet forums amplified sightings, and over time, the legend became a composite of historical accounts, modern interpretations, and cultural storytelling. Some elements of the modern myth, such as cyclical sighting theories, appear to be later additions rather than the original folkloric components. These additions reflect how communities organize patterns with uncertain information. The Dogman becomes not just a creature story, but a living narrative system, one that adapts to cultural input over time.
Why the legend endures.
The persistence of the Michigan Dogman legend is not necessarily evidence of the creature itself. It is evidence of something more fundamental: human perception under uncertainty. The forest is one of the oldest environments that humans have both depended on and feared. It is vast, unpredictable, and difficult to fully observe. In such environments, the brain naturally attempts to interpret it. Incomplete sensory data. Movement becomes threat, sound becomes presence, and silence becomes anticipation. The Dogman exists at the intersection of these interpretive processes, whether as physical entity, misperception, or symbolic construct. It represents the human need to categorize the unknown. It is not simply a story about Michigan. It is a story about perception under uncertainty, about the boundaries between known and unknown, and about the way fear shapes interpretation.
Closing statement. So, tonight, we leave the forests behind, but the forests do not leave us. Because whether the Michigan Dogman is a physical creature, a misidentified animal, or a cultural echo of deeper psychological fear, the experience it represents continues to persist. That moment when visibility fades, when sound becomes unclear, when the mind begins to construct meaning from darkness. And if there is one truth found across every account, every variation, every retelling, it is this: in the wilderness, certainty does not last long, and the unknown always finds a way to take shape. Thank you for listening to another episode of After Dark, the Night Otter Files. Sleep well tonight. And if you find yourself driving through northern Michigan and something begins pacing your headlights just beyond the tree line, remember, not everything that watches you needs to be seen to be real. Good night. Sleep well, or don't.